more serious. So.
Doing great.
By the time I got home,
That's great.
I left lunch.
Yeah.
Well,
And Gary was
you're gonna make you feel better.
he was hungry.
You'll make him feel better.
Well, you got him. That's good to see you. Good to see you.
Feel better.
Yeah,
First person I know who's seen more spirit than you.
Cheryl Island.
He's getting nervous too. I'm like, you're nervous. He's like, you're feeling
I should know.
I'm the one that
What we get
Right.
tonight?
I've been talking to him over here listening.
And you got a choice. You work surgical, withdrawal, or just an in-line practice.
We don't need them stopping you from eating.
So,
But.
you know, I don't know how this works. I have just mentioned. That's that.
and he goes,
We'll be happy to share with you.
he goes,
That thing about, questionnaire, you've got 72 hours. Yeah. Well, when I went to that, I don't understand the questionnaire.
They want to where you go. Pennsylvania and the county is.
But the shit that comes up says none of that stuff. So somebody's got to sit and explain to you. You've been to the Delphus Library? Well, there's three steps.
I think Gary's.
The first step is the passport. The second step is the COVID card for your vaccination. The third step is
well, that's
the
what he said.
So when it comes up, I have no clue. Airport, ain't so much you can explain without
On we were gonna do macaroni. And I actually said, yeah. She said $15. She goes, well, according to the box order, free. So I said, $5, I'll do six. I said, if it ain't gonna keep the water hot on the stove, it's more. And, I started at 5, like we did here, with maybe a 10. Wait a minute. Jesus, what? Actually, never done it out of water. Well, now.
Did you guys hear how much money they raised?
Yeah.
We went yesterday to pick it up. We definitely didn't do full guard.
I didn't know, Andrewville won the, Golden Boy. I don't know who won it.
How you doing, Mike?
Pretty good.
There was somebody in Westfield that won.
All right, but, Gary, we back to
Yeah,
What's that mean?
2 minutes.
Yeah, I'm.
2 minutes. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Well, make you aware of our guests that are here this morning. Kenny and Billy is taking the baby back there. Olive and your name is Kenny Wayne. Okay, all right, Kenny Wayne. All right, very good. We welcome you.
Say again?
It's all yours.
Yes. Now, well, what we're going to do, just so we know where we're at in the book, and then what we're going to do though is we're going to take a short jump into the topic of the Greek philosophy. So we will start, when we do start, at the top of page 32. But before we go there, we talked about, up until this point, some of the cultural ideas that were really a problem for within the church, outside of the church, and also witnessing to those in and out of the church. So not there. So those Hellenism, the Hellenistic ideas, they were really having an impact. And when we talk about them, we're going to talk about each idea for a few minutes, and then we're going to talk about the challenge that would present both within a congregation of believers and witnessing to a congregation, witnessing to those who are not part of a congregation. And we'll also take a moment and talk, is this still a problem today? And so, looking back, the Hellenistic period spans 3 centuries between the death of the Macedonian king Alexander the Great in 323 BC to the rise of Augustus in Rome in 31 BC. But what we find is during this time frame, the philosophies that were being developed and that people were starting to follow had a lasting impact. So when we talk about Greece, there's really 3 time frames. There is, of course, the Hellenistic Greek that we just talked about. There's Classic Greek, and that is the time frame before 323. And then after, I think I said 31 BC, yep. After that is basically the Roman Greek. So in those 3 time frames, the Hellenistic Greek really had an influence. And so they advanced the arts, astrology, exploration, literature, theater, architecture, music, mathematics, science, and philosophy. So geometry really came to rise. You may have heard of Archimedes' principle. That is during that era. So although they had an impact on a wide section of society, especially with mathematics and science, then our focus, though, is just on the philosophy today. So when we look at philosophy, there's college courses that just talk about and study this subject, so we're only going to touch it, but we're going to look at 3. Stoicism, this is a hard one to pronounce, Epicureanism, and Pyrrhonism. So the second one is dealing with good spirit and happiness, is where that name comes from. And you may have heard of Stoic, like someone's very stoic. That term is still, used to describe people today. And Pyrrhonism, really, that term did not carry forward in that context. So first, we're going to talk about the Stoicism. It was founded by Zeno of Citium in Athens in the early 3rd century. It's a philosophy of personal eudaimonic virtue ethics that's informed by a system of logic and its view of the natural world, asserting that the practice of virtue is both necessary and sufficient to achieve, and then here's the word again, eudaimonia, and that means flourishing by means of living an ethical life. So there's a lot of terms here. It's easier to read and then look up each term. But overall, what this view is that if you practice logic and if you practice virtue with living an ethical life, you will find happiness. That's all you'll need. We'll talk about this. So right off, what is ethical life? What is ethics? We hear a lot about it today. So the problem with ethics and virtue is it's living according to right and wrong. Now, that sounds okay. However, who says what right and wrong is? So once again, if you're living outside of the Bible and you're thinking you're living an ethical life because you're following the ethics of those who you live with, which, there's lots of things that we consider unethical. Stealing, abortion, there's all of these things. But if society as a whole feels they're okay, then you'd probably be considered living an ethical life. So right off, the problem is that ethical life on right and wrong, they follow an ever-changing standard. Because what people think, even in the US, what was ethical now would definitely not have been ethical in the 1950s or even earlier. So the problem with ethics, if we have group consensus, then it's going to change. And so there was no absolute value. So that's the problem with the standard. So the Stoics identified the path to, that good spirit happiness with a life spent practicing the cardinal virtues. So, that was prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, and living in accordance with nature. So that group of people, when you talk about prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, those issues, although on the surface they sound good. So if you practice justice, you're normally still in that ethical dilemma of, what is just? And then it goes back to, well, who set the standard? If you're following an earthly standard of justice, then if you're in the Middle East and you steal and they cut your hand off, that's within the bounds of normal justice. Here, that would really be shocking. So that just on modern day, those standards of justice are very different. There's a huge distance between what we consider and what is other people consider. Temperance. Temperance is not indulging. And so is temperance, that sounds like it's good, right? It's not overindulging. But temperance in itself doesn't tell you what activities you can or can't do. It just says don't do too many of them. So if you like going out and you're partying and you're doing drugs, then temperance would say just don't do a lot. Don't do that a lot or you're indulging. So in temperance, you can do what you want, just don't do a lot of it. And if you're living with the other, with fortitude and with prudence, then prudence is basically knowing how to prepare and act. But once again, in prudence, if you're preparing and acting, well, what sets your standard for what you should be doing? Well, other people do. So with this group of people, how hard would they be to witness to? Pretty hard, right? Because you're telling them they're living a sinful life, and their philosophy is, well, no, I'm observing the cardinal virtues, and I'm living within nature. So I'm not overindulging, I'm being ethical, and so they would have all of these things to tell you that no, that they're not sinful, bad people, that they're actually in the pursuit of happiness, and in that pursuit, they have this formula of how to do it. So witnessing to them will be hard. It's hard for witnessing to anyone, but these people automatically, they feel that they're okay. So it's going to work on saying that there's a standard outside of their own that they have to adhere to. So, and this is a problem, it would have been a problem within the church. Because if you find happiness in life and purpose through the cardinal virtues and living in nature, then what about what God says? Where does that fit in? When God, is saying, don't do this, how does that fit in? When, as long as you don't overindulge, you're okay. Or, especially for New Century Christians, we were to reach the lost. And in reaching the lost with the gospel message, the first thing that they're learning is that they themselves, when we say lost, they're destined for hell because of their sinful life. And the only way to avoid that is through Christ, who paid their penalty, so salvation. So this will be a hard within the church and external to the church. So if you had a group of people within your congregation that really believe that, then they're not going to be very active because they pretty much don't see the need for it. So that is one mindset. The next mindset is Epicureanism, and that is, we're just going to, instead of saying that word over and over, we're going to keep it with, you're in search of, I think I said, your good life and a good spirit and happiness. So this group of people also had a thought, and so it argued that pleasure was the chief good in life, and they differed a little bit from hedonism in the fact that they also thought there should be some balance and just not all out. And we'll see that. But they're very close to hedonism. So it advocated living in such a way as to derive the greatest amount of pleasure possible during one's lifetime, yet doing so moderately in order to avoid the suffering incurred by overindulgence. So we have hedonism that are all out. We're just going to do everything that makes us happy. And then we have this group of people that's like, we're pretty much going to do everything that makes us happy, but we're going to try and do it without overindulging. And so this group of people, the sole purpose in life is their own happiness. And they're going to do whatever makes them happy. So emphasis was placed on pleasure of the mind rather than physical pleasure. So once again, they differed from hedonism a little bit. And since political life could give rise to desires that could disturb virtue and one's peace of mind, that's kind of like an odd statement, but that was 2,000 years ago. And that kind of statement is kind of true today. Since political life could give rise to desires that could disturb virtue and one's peace of mind, such as lust for power or desire for fame, participation in politics was discouraged, because that being in politics is supposed to be for the greater good, to have some sort of, you're pushing a policy. Even today, you want to support things that provide for the greater good, but the problem is, well, what's good? So if good means more money, then that's what you would go after. If good means more anything, then that term is very loose. So there's no really defining it in that way. So further, now this is a biggie, further, they sought to eliminate the fear of the gods, because remember, at this time in life, in the church era, right at the turn of this, right in the early AD, there were many gods. Every town would have a patron god. The Greeks had a whole list of gods. The Romans had gods. All the Jewish neighbors had gods. And so the one thing that all of these, not our God, not the Christian God, but all the other gods that they were all following, the basic premise is, you will do this, this, and this for the God, whatever that God, his formula is basically. And by doing that, you will get some sort of reward back. So you do this, 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 you get a reward. You do this, 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 you get the reward. And if you don't do it, well, then there's the threat of punishment, right? So all of these different, the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, all of them had all these religions that had various gods, but the premise was the same. We're winning the war because, Baal is satisfied and happy with us, so he's helping us, or he's not, so we're losing. We don't get grain, we have a famine, all of these things. So in this idea, they sought to eliminate the fear of the gods and of death, seeing that those two fears are the cause of a lot of strife in life. So the first one, their fear of not following all of these pagan deities required, was you were always trying to do something or not do something. And then the fear of death also played into it. So if you, as this group of people, the search for happiness was first and foremost in your life. Then we're not going to get involved with politics because that will distract us from finding happiness. And then we're not going to worry about any religions. No, all religions are out because all religions want you to do something, right? So if we're only going to live for ourselves and we're not going to do anything for anyone else, so we're definitely not going to worry about the pagan religions, we're also not going to worry about death. Because if you start worrying about death, you're going to start worrying that maybe you should do something the pagan religions are asking you to do, right? Because the different pagan religions, they offered an afterlife, even the Egyptians, if you were following what that pagan god said. So the only way to not have doubt in not following anything is to not worry about what happens when you die. So this philosophy, kind of, we don't call it that today, but kind of, that idea still exists, right? That there aren't any gods. I can live my life exactly how I want. And I'm not worried about death because when you're dead, you're gone. There's nothing you can do to stop it. And if I'm just gone, I'm gone. I won't even know I'm dead because I don't exist. So in an early church, this Hellenistic view, if you went into a town and this is what they believed, it's going to be a hard one to reach too, right? Because right off, they're like, we don't believe in gods and we don't believe in death or any afterlife at all. We just don't believe it. We're not going to worry about it. And we're only in search of pleasure. Whatever makes us happy, of course, in moderation again. But whatever makes us happy, that's what we're in pursuit of. And we're only going to serve ourselves. And we're not worried about it. We're not worried about any possible gods. And we're not worried about consequences of death. So external to the church, if you show up in a town like that, that's going to be a tough one. That is really, because you're talking to a group of people who are not even open that there are gods. They've openly rejected it. And it's hard to talk about going to hell when they're not worried about the afterlife anyway. So within the church, if these people came in, then it's a constant, you're having to change. Now, all three of them, not that these people shouldn't be saved and brought into the church, absolutely. But the church body and discipleship, this, goes back to why is discipleship important. If you're discipling one of these people, you would have to continuously confront their idea with the gospel message. And you would have to continually say, that's what society believes, but it's not the truth. Because we have the truth in this book. So that's pretty much the same argument we have a lot of times today, right? I can't help what society believes. Just because they believe it didn't make it right. And you're going to base your life, if you're basing it on that, you're basing it on a lie. And you will suffer the consequences, whether you believe in consequences or not. And so now the next group is going to address the whole, well, how do you know you're right? Right? Because that is also an argument that all of them would use is, how do you know you're right? There's this whole wall full of gods, And now you're telling me you found the right one. All right, and you're like, well, we have, and let me tell you why. But that's going to be the same type of argument. So when this group of people are saved and brought into the congregation, that's why discipleship is important. You have to change so many aspects of what they believe that keep creeping out in church. So let's say we're going to send a missionary somewhere. And if we, if they still have some of those, well, why does it matter ideas, then they're not going to be very supportive of paying to send a missionary or even going themselves on witnessing to others. So this is another idea. Here's a third idea we're going to cover. And so this is hieronymism, and it's the earliest Western form of philosophical skepticism. So we definitely have this today. And so, when we use the term skeptic, we're talking about, I go on a fishing trip, for instance, and I ate the fish, and I didn't take any pictures of the fish, but I caught a 42-pound bass. And you're like, I'm very skeptical of your 42-pound bass. And you're like, no, it was huge. It was so big. It could have eaten me. It was so big. Its mouth, its large mouth. It probably had eaten 3 dogs. The mouth was so big. And you're like, well, how do you prove that? And you're like, I saw it. I know. That's why I'm telling you. And they're like, well, do you have the giant skeleton? No, it fell apart after I ate it. You have a picture of it? Well, I didn't have my camera. I was in the boat. And then you're like, I'm truly skeptical of your claim, right? So it's not outright saying you're a liar, but that 42-pound bass, you're like, I think you would have held on to that and not eaten the 42-pound bass. So that's where we get this skepticism, where I don't really believe that, right? We have that today. And that is, like in my example, how do I prove to you I had a 42-pound bass? Okay, well, and we're going to see this too. How do I prove to you that Christ died for your sins? I can't see that. You can't? So, yeah. So this is where we're going to go with this. So skepticism. So, boy, that's still around today. And it comes up anytime you hear a story at work. I'm kind of skeptical on the level of truth and how much embellishment is in the story, right? So here are this earliest form of philosophical skepticism. They too were after the good spirit and happiness, right? So now we have another way to find happiness and fulfillment in your life. They believed that one's opinion about non-evident matters prevent one from attaining that eudaimonia, which is that good spirit or happiness. So have you ever heard the word dogma? And so what does that word mean? Dogma for Christians, we believe that the Bible is a communication from God by divine revelation. Right? That is the foundation of everything in your Christian life. That the Bible is divine revelation from God. And it is without error, inerrant, right? It's without error. And that Bible communicated to us everything that God wanted to tell us. We're not waiting for another prophet to rise up. We're not waiting for like volume 2 to be written by somebody. We're not waiting for any of that because God gave us everything we need to know. And the whole foundation of what we believe as Christians starts with, do you believe the Bible? Because if you can't say you believe the Bible, then you're not going to believe any of the doctrine. You're not going to believe that Christ came for you. You're not going to believe God created the world and the universe. You're not going to create, there's just everything at that point it's just another book. So for Christians, when they talk about dogma, that's what they're looking at for us, that it starts with the Bible is God's revelation to us, and it is inspired word and without error. And that's where we start all of our practices and our beliefs about God and how we understand God. It influences how we understand ourselves. It tells us the purpose in life. God told us to go out and reach the lost and his disciples. So that dogma, for Christians, is the core of Christianity. If you don't start by saying, yes, I understand the Bible is God's word to us, then you really have nowhere that you're starting from. So for these people, and they believe that one's opinion about non-evident matters, now that's where I've put the word dogma, is what prevents people from reaching happiness, right? And good spirit. So for any non-evident matter, they make an argument for and against the topic, and since it can't be concluded, they suspend belief. So have you ever had people that you're trying to witness to them and they can both tell you scripture, right? And then they can argue against it because what proof can you offer? That is that philosophical skepticism. So it's even harder because they probably know what you're talking about and can quote the Bible. And then they can quote skepticism like, well, how can you prove it? And with that, since it can't be proven, and they can argue it from either side, that's when we're going to suspend belief. It's just another thing that can't be proven. So that one is hard. Do you see that today? This is a philosophical skepticism that survives today, and where people are like, if you can't really prove it, if I can't see it, you might hear this, if science can't replicate it, then it's just what you believe, right? Because if science can't reproduce it, then it's okay that you believe it. I'm just not going to. And so with that, each belief is counter to living for God, and it focuses on living for self. And that, as you see, those philosophies, they each center on how can I be the happiest? And in being the happiest, we're going to discount, there might be a method to it. We have the virtues that we're going to follow. We're going to have, we don't get involved because we don't want to be part of it. It'll make us unhappy to be involved. And finally, this one's really, the philosophical skepticism is, if it can't be proven, I don't even want to talk about it. It's just another idea. So each of them, though, focuses on self. How do I make me the happiest? And any thought that doing something that I initially don't think will make me happy, I'm not going to do it. And so there is no, I have a relationship. I was created, so there must be a creator. There's no, if I'm created, I must have a purpose. What is that purpose? All of that. And so each of these beliefs would have many reasons to reject the gospel and reject a gospel life. Because if you're living a gospel life and you're living for God, then does it involve sacrifice? Yes. Tithing is a sacrifice, right? That's 10% that you're not spending on yourself. Does it involve a sacrifice of time? Yes, here we are this morning. There's any number of things we could do to satisfy self during this time, even if it's just sleeping. But here we are. And so these philosophies were rampant. They were all over. They were part of the early, they were what early Christians experienced. And so that polytheism, there's lots of gods, there's many gods, choose your own God, all the way to, I don't choose any God. You can't see them, they can't touch them. Not one of them has come down and spoke to me, so I'm just not going to believe any of it. So with that, this is a really only half an hour talk about it, but this was a problem in the early church, and it's still a problem today. Every time a group of people get together that are Christians, we still all have slightly different ideas, right? We have slightly different priorities. If you've ever been to a business meeting, you'll know, some people really have a higher priority of that than I do, or I have a higher priority of something than you do. And so, and we're a body of believers. But just because we're a body of believers didn't automatically make us all have exactly the same priority level for exactly every single thing. So that's why when we talked about it affecting aspects of Jewish life, these ideas, when they came in, and as these ideas traveled, don't they sound, they really sound like they would be a nice way to live. Honestly, it's like, oh, look at this. We finally have something. We don't have to go to the temple. We don't have to go to the pagan deities. We don't have to sacrifice to them. The only goal in life is to be happy. And especially, we go as far as saying, in order to be happy, we're just going to discount the whole religious system. And we're just going to know when you die, you're gone. So with those two things, you better live the happiest life you can now before you're done. So those were the three big categories of Hellenistic ideas that were influencing that era. And like we see, some of those, they may not have the same names today, or they may be very close, but there's types of thoughts we still run into. And the biggie is, I'm number one, right? No matter what philosophy, you can blend them all together, you can make up your own. But in the end, if your philosophy is, I'm number one and I choose everything, then you have jumped into the philosophy of, what I think is my happiness is the most important thing, and that's what I'm going to work towards. If God is number one, then now we have to look and see, well, what does God say number one is? And that's where we have the Bible, and we look into the Bible and we see, oh, this is what God says I'm supposed to do. This is God says how I'm supposed to live. This is what I'm supposed to do when I interact with other people. This is what I'm to do with money. I'm a steward, not just the owner. And, so it goes, but it all comes back to the easy question, who's number one? And if it's not God, then no matter what you say, it's yourself, because you're making all the decisions and you're living according to the values of that decision. So that's a little backdrop of some of those Hellenistic ideas that were really problematic. So let's jump to page 32, and we stopped, and I'm going to start with the background of the New Testament. So remember, the New Testament, the Bible itself, is not a history book. It's not a chronological order of battles. It's not a chronological order of people. There's gaps, and we saw that between the intertestament period, between the last prophet and the New Testament. So what is the Bible then? The Bible is God's message to us. And the parts that are in the Bible are important. And so, and I tell you, when you read the Bible, if you read it and you don't understand why something's important, you're not asking the right questions. You need to get with somebody and say, why do we have this whole segment of the Bible? Why do we have this book, this chapter? Because remember, the Bible is very thin when you consider, like For those who are older and you remember Encyclopedia Britannica, it was like a whole volume that sat on the dresser, and many junior high nights were spent looking up stuff in Encyclopedia Britannica so I could find the information. So the Bible's information to us is who we are, who God is, how that relationship has been, how that relationship is now, and our responsibilities within that relationship. And so we have to keep in mind the Bible doesn't talk about every facet of Jewish life or every facet of any life. The characters that arise are those who are interacting with God. So the information about the life in the New Testament comes from two chief sources: ancient writers who described habits of daily life, and archaeology, which has unearthed many previously unknown facts about living conditions and practices of the period. So we're separated by 2,000 years. I know for many of us, we tell grandpa stories, right? Grandpa may be dead. We might tell great-grandpa stories, right? He's probably dead. And we're passing down a little bit of family history, right? But do we talk about the relative that was alive in 1000? No, because what do we know about that relative who was alive in the year 1000? I don't even know who that relative is. So with that, there's, we readily accept gaps in our own personal history because we realize the history that we have about our family is what's been passed down. But does anybody write a family history book? No. So we're very fortunate that we have the Bible that God gave us that gives us all of this family history, if you will. How did God interact with people from the time of creation until the time of salvation? And then we also see in the New Testament, from the time of the apostles and the books, we see how we do, what's our responsibility among a body of believers. Still more, what does God want? And now we have a final book that says God's in control. And it doesn't really give us dates. It doesn't tell us the end will start on any such day, but it does tell us it will get bad. God's in charge. God already knew it. God already said it. And so that's one less worry we have to have, because no matter what happens, God didn't lose control. So now back to this. So home construction. A home in the New Testament varied from the tent in a desert for the Bedouins to a stucco or sun-dried brick of Palestine, or to brick and concrete of Rome. Now, if you've ever seen pictures of Rome, I'm fortunate to been to Rome, and you see the Colosseum, you see palaces. When we lived in Sicily, we would go and see villas that were made at the time of Christ and before. It was just amazing, the level of detail, the artwork. And so what you see is, whose homes make it? The wealthy, right? That's why you do an archaeological dig and they find this mosaic on the wall, and they were mosaics on the floor and all of this. That costs a lot of money. That person's home is made of stone and brick, and it survived. So what do we have even now? What's everyone's home made of, probably? Wood, right? We have. Oh, I didn't hear it.
I said plastic.
Well, okay. Let's say it's made of various levels of plastic and wood. Vinyl, right? So we have that.
So if you're me for construction next to it,
Well,
BBS is my shop.
yeah. Will our homes be around in 2,000 years?
Probably not.
Probably not. I am hoping I outlive my home. I mean, I would be happy enough to go, I passed away and I outlived the home before it finally died. So we know the homes we have for normal people, they're just going to go, they're going to disintegrate. And we see that. You drive in an area that people moved out, they abandoned the homes, and they just start collapsing, right? So some of the things that we find out, there's not a lot of archaeological digs on Bedouin tents because the tents just don't make it. They were having to replace them during their life. They're just not going to be there. But we do have writers that wrote about the lifestyle that was going on. So we do have some information. So the desert tents, a portable. Now think about this today and think about wherever you live. And you may be kind of, I wish I lived this is a normal. I wish it was a little bigger. I wish it was this. I wish it was that. Which is just how we are. I wish it was a little, whatever it was. But think about if you lived your whole life in a tent in the desert. So I'm sure those people were thinking, if we only had a stucco house in town, then we would be in. I would be so happy. If we had the stucco house in town, that would be great. But the tents were made of animal skins and could be enlarged as families grow. You just put some more skins together, do an add-on, you keep having more kids, keep adding space, more kids, more space. And so as family members place their tents close together, they form a camp because eventually your kids grow up, they get married, and what do you need? Another tent. And then all of a sudden they start having kids, and before you know it, we have a whole camp of tents because we have 10 kids, all of them got married, they're having 10 kids, we grow pretty quick. So now, who was a tent maker in the New Testament? Say again? Yes, right? So just right there, we know, that was a pretty common profession. That we have Paul as a tent maker, right? So there was still a demand for tents, even though we have like the city of Jerusalem where they were living in, the ones living there were living in buildings, and we had people in major cities that were living in buildings, but that doesn't mean there still wasn't a demand. There were still people living in tents. Otherwise, how would Paul have made a living as a tent maker? So there must have been a good demand. And so it says he probably didn't make tents for the Bedouins. It doesn't say for sure, but for military personnel who found the portability of tents useful in a transitory military life. Acts 18, 1-3. So Paul found a way to provide an income for himself, be a missionary, have a skill and a profession that was portable. Wherever he was at, if he could find the material, he could start making tents and provide for himself. So the tents were one lifestyle. So in Palestine, many houses in the Palestinian area were constructed of stone because it was cheap and readily available. So why do we pick lumber for the most part in the U.S.? Say again? It's cheap and readily available, right? Or it used to be cheap. It's probably still less expensive than building a house out of quarried rock. But if you go to a large portion of the Middle East, you don't cut down trees just to build a house because trees are few and far between. And then when you have trees, you're trying to cultivate wonderful things like figs, olives, all different fruit that you can harvest and enjoy. And so that's why they were constructed of stone. Stone is everywhere. It is over there. And then it says smaller stones were packed into the larger stone gaps, and a layer of mud was plastered over the interior. And larger houses may have had a double thickness of stone, and in the Jordan Valley, it was easier to build houses with mud bricks because of the availability of a very rich, thick mud. So change locally, that change was because of the ease of building material. And so bricks are a uniform size, right? You can, even with a wood frame, you could construct it where you could make all the bricks, have a board that goes scrapes across the top. Now, are all the bricks going to be the same size? And you heat them and dry them, and now they're used for construction. So that would be even easier than putting big rocks and then filling in the holes with little rocks and covering it all with a plaster material. So the roof of houses, now this is important too. The roof of a house in Palestine was usually made by placing wood beams across the top of the walls and covering them with brush and placing a layer of mud or clay on top of it. The roof had to be rolled after each heavy rain in order to flatten it out. Now, I don't know the physics behind this, but I know on my dirt road, it will develop ripples. And they come by and they plow it flat, and sure enough, something happens, and now my car goes, as you're riding the ripples. So a similar issue, I guess, with the roofs. All that rain falling on it, you would have to re-flatten it. Now, there's a story coming up about somebody. Now, remember, that is your roof, just like your roof is today. It's a lot of work. It keeps you dry. What if you were having a meeting in your house and a speaker came and these people tore a hole in your roof? Right? What would you think? Yeah, the timbers are now moved or cut. That's not because you can't just fill it in, right? Because it'll be a hole, and you step in, and you're going to fall through. So, is there a Bible story where a group of people tore up a roof and lowered someone in? And we read that, and you just kind of pass over the fact that, wait, these guys went on top of this house and they tore a hole in the roof during a meeting so they could lower someone down, and that's not easy to fix. So and we'll get to that next week, but think about reading your Bible this week. I won't tell you where, because you can look it up, and reread that story and think about the fact of, one, the homeowner, he had one side of the story, right? Because he got left with a big hole in his roof. And two, think about this side of the story. Do you have friends when you were truly sick and there was no hope that would carry you to another house, bring you up on the roof, just dig a hole through that person's roof so that you could get down and see the person, in this instance, Jesus, who is your only hope? Do you have friends today that would do that? They would pick you up. You can't even walk. They're going to bring you there, put you on a roof, destroy this guy's roof in order to get you in. So that will be, we're going to go ahead. It's already almost 10 till. We're going to stop on the third paragraph of page 32. And if you want, you can read some about some of those other Hellenistic ideas, because it was a time of, all these ideas are coming up, and there were challenges to society. There were challenges to the religious system, and those challenges were also challenging for Christians. And so we'll go ahead and close in prayer. God, we thank you that we have a book that you left, and in that book, it tells us about you. It tells us the expectations you have for us. It tells us how do we live for you, and it tells us if we have accepted Christ, we have a future, and that future isn't just here on earth, it spans eternity. God, as we get ready to go into the church service, let us focus on you, because this is our time to be with you. In Jesus' name, amen.